Welcome to Chatter. I'm David Priess. This week, historian and former intelligence officer Mark Stout on World War I and intelligence in American memory.
The largest battle that the United States ever fought was in World War I. It was the Meuse-Argonne campaign. And, not a lot of people remember it today. I mean, not every historian of World War I knows about it, but we're not exactly a big slice of the population, let's put it that way. One of the key things that comes out of World War I is that it came more and more accepted that it is ethical to have peacetime espionage. Most of our major wars have had big bumper stickers, right? The Civil War reunited the Union and ended slavery, right? And World War II defeated fascism and ended the Holocaust.
Solid narratives.
Yeah. And well, what was World War I exactly? Can you sum that up for me, David?
Yeah, there's no bumper sticker that gets it the same way.
No.
Mark Stout, welcome finally to Chatter.
Well, thanks very much, Dave. It's great to be here.
I say finally because I've known you for, I don't know how many years now, but for quite a while. But I also know of the project you've been working on since the beginning of time.
That's about right, yeah.
Which has been a labor of love, I hope, but probably a labor of frustration as the years went by. But it's finally borne fruit.
And let me tell you how glad I am to see the backside of this project. But I'm happy to talk about it.
Well, we don't talk about backsides much on here, but the backside of the book is almost as good as the front of the book, which has a brilliant image from World War I of, I think, aerial reconnaissance and a very, very tall map with people placing on it. And I'm talking about your new book, World War I and the Foundations of American Intelligence.
Yeah.
When did you start thinking about this topic and why?
2006. So if you want to do the arithmetic, that was 17 years ago. And I was looking for a project to write a PhD dissertation in history in. And I met with a mentor of mine, a really fine intelligence historian named Dave Alvarez, over beers, and of course. And he suggested to me that I do something with U.S. intelligence in World War I. And I didn't know much about World War I, frankly, at that point. And my immediate reaction was, oh, that's ridiculous. That must have been done to death, because I did know something about World War II. And there are huge, bookshelves full of books about U.S. intelligence in World War II. So I'm like, okay, I'll look into it. And there's very, very little, it turned out. And that was great, because what that meant was that almost everything, not everything, but almost anything that I wanted to write about U.S. intelligence and World War I would be new. There are little bits and pieces of it, and important bits and pieces of it that people had looked at. But the literature was very, very narrow. So I turned into my PhD dissertation, and then that got 100% rewritten, and I kid you not, and longer, and became this book, which is finally out just a few weeks ago as we speak now.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
I want to use the book essentially as a springboard to talk about some wider issues of World War I and U.S. cultural memory and all of that. Your background for writing this, however, is not only the dissertation research and then the years of throwing away all that actual text and rewriting the text, but also experience in the national security community. Talk about that a bit.
Yeah, so I spent in my first career 21 years in the national security community, and of that 13 was in the intelligence community, all but 1 year on the analytics side. And I worked on military intelligence analysis, though aimed at Russia primarily. But yeah, so that's one thing I brought to this. And I think it's actually important to have at least some intelligence historians who have a background in intelligence. Now, on the one hand, the very reasonable critique can be that maybe they're too sympathetic.
Yeah, you're biased,
to their subject. Yeah, and sure. and I own that. I mean, I try to be as objective as I can, but we're all captive of where we came from. That said, on the other hand, I think people who've worked in the intelligence business have a comparative advantage in terms of reading intelligence documents and understanding what the writers meant and what role these documents played in the process. Now, that is certainly learnable by people who weren't in the business, but I think it comes more easily to people who have some experience in it. So yeah, I was in the intelligence community for 13 years, did some other things in the national security policy community. And then to simplify a little bit, between careers 1 and 2, I was the historian at the International Spy Museum for 3 years. And then I started teaching graduate students, which I've done for something over a decade now, for a long time as a full-time basis, and now just merely as an adjunct. So,
I believe you are the second historian of the International Spy Museum on the podcast. Vince was on talking about the
my successor.
history of cryptology in the museum and all of that. And maybe we'll get Andrew on as well,
That would be
the
great.
current historian, although his title has changed slightly since your day. They've slightly shifted
They've
things.
shifted it
just
around.
a
I'm not
bit.
sure precisely what his title is, but yes, he's another successor of mine.
Yeah. So you bring all that experience to this, and I guess maybe I'll challenge you a bit on that assertion in one limited way, that there is a strong potential for bias of people from the community doing intel history, and maybe that's true of me and others who have written about very current events, right? Things recently, because you've interacted with some of the actors in the play. I would guess that you, with the temporal distance on this, I mean, I'm not going to talk about your age, but I doubt you actually served in World War I with Pershing, so you probably don't have a lot of direct memories and biases based solely on your experience in the intel community, because it is so different than 100 plus years ago.
Well, that's a very good point. I think you're absolutely right. And certainly a lot of the specific topics about which people might be biased, or have their roots in the Cold War or the war on terrorism. So should the CIA have overthrown Mossadegh in 1953, or were our intelligence tactics in the war on terrorism justified or not, and all those sorts of things. And none of that was around in World War I.
Right.
Indeed, CIA wasn't around during World War I. I think so. Yes, I think it's certainly a lesser problem, potential problem, with regard to World War I. That said, I think there are a lot of people out there who now, as then, question the moral foundations, the moral rectitude of the very business, or certainly of parts of it at any rate, espionage, covert action, and a lot of the counterintelligence and counterespionage stuff. So I don't think it's wholly devoid of potential for bias. But yes, it's a whole lot less than if I was working on recent CIA history, for instance.
Sure. Well, this conversation in part is therapy for me, or maybe a re-education session, because I recall now several years ago when my book came out on the PDB.
A wonderful book, by the way. Everyone should buy it.
Stop. That's not why I mention it. I mention it because of the opposite, which is at the beginning as a way of saying intelligence tailored to the president and really focused on that really is a very modern story.
Yes.
But the way I phrased the way into that, I recall distinctly, I had a line about, the U.S. intelligence system had lagged far behind others, and World War I only moved the ball forward slightly. And you just said something to me like, David, you should have talked to me first. And to be fair, in the language around that, as we'll get to later on, it was really focused on intelligence analysis and more specifically tailored briefings for presidents. But even then I felt like, I need to be more careful with these sweeping generalizations about periods of which I know very little. So first of all, thank you for saying that at the time and calling me out. And here is your chance to slap me in public repeatedly by giving me all of the details to show that no, World War I did move the ball forward significantly, to the point that you make the claim in your book, World War I gave birth to modern American intelligence.
Yes.
To assess that, we have to do a few things. First of all, we have to see what American intelligence was like before World War I. We have to talk about what happened just before, during, just after the war, and then why you can say that American intelligence, the way we see it now, was moved forward enough that it's not a later period. That really is definitive. So let's go back to not the beginning of Washington and Lincoln and all of that, but to a period that most Americans, even national security professionals, don't know anything about, the 1880s. And that's what you point to as the true seeds of what we now see as a modern American intelligence, mainly based on two organizations, the Navy and what was then the War Department. Talk about the bureaucratic institutions within those, how large they were, how important they were in a general sense, during the 1880s into the 1890s?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. So the circumstances when you get to the 1880s are, the United States and actually also the Confederacy had done a lot of actually pretty sophisticated intelligence things in the Civil War. The problem was that on the U.S. side, on the Union side, that basically all got forgotten because that was done at the level of armies in the field, which all got demobilized and didn't exist anymore. It wasn't done primarily wasn't done at the Washington level, and so basically everything went away with intel after the Civil War. And then the U.S. military, both the Navy and the Army, enter this period of of the doldrums, right? And they are very much not keeping up with world standards on what modern of the time militaries do.
In part because they could, right? There was no direct challenge from great powers in Europe to the United States in the 1870s.
Yeah, minimal. I mean, there was thought that maybe we'd have to fight a war against Britain, which would be a war in Canada. But these were all pretty darn hypothetical and not real high threat scenarios. Of course, the U.S. Army was engaged in fighting Native Americans out to the west, but that wasn't a big challenge the way that fighting Britain or later fighting Germany or even for that matter fighting Spain was, right? And indeed, there were a lot of discussions for a while about what is the U.S. Army even for, right? So into these doldrums. During these doldrums, there starts to be a military reform movement in both the Navy and the Army and the War Department. And they're looking to European examples. And they are seeing that leading European powers, most notably the Prussians/Germans, were starting to build general staffs, right, that would aggregate, that would pull together data and do detailed planning for how wars were going to work, right? And that the Prussians and others were starting to have components of those general staffs that looked at not how many trains we could mobilize and get how many troops with how many rifles in how many hours or days to a particular location, but how much of that the enemy could do. Right. And those, we know today as intelligence officers. And they started arguing for a wide series of military reforms, of which let's create intelligence offices for the Army and the Navy, or the War Department and the Navy, was part. And that was really how this was born. The Office of Naval Intelligence was the first, 1883, and then the War Department, not to be outdone by the darn Navy, followed suit in 1885. But these were very, very small organizations. In terms of people in Washington, we're talking about tiny handfuls, 3, 4, depending on exactly when you look, 3, 4, 5, a dozen maybe. Though, in addition, they did include the military and naval attachés, naval officers and Army officers who were attached to U.S. embassies abroad to be military diplomats, but also to collect what today we would call overt human intelligence, just what they pick up in the course of working with and alongside their host militaries.
Still very few of those.
But still very few of those, too.
Attachés weren't as common at that time.
No, I mean, you almost any country the U.S. has diplomatic relations with these days, which is almost all of them, we have an attaché of some sort or another, and often multiple. Yeah, back then, again, it was another, sort of modest handful of attachés as well.
Wow.
So, all right, you end up with 2 handfuls of people, maybe, being the, U.S. intelligence at the time.
See, that's interesting because as a sense of scale, if you compare the Army or the War Department and the Naval Department to the size of today's Pentagon, of course, there's a huge difference. But even then, I would say the percentage of people involved in intelligence is way smaller because we do have a relatively large intelligence community and attaché system. So even based on the relative scale, it was still an immense small group doing this, right?
No, that's absolutely right. And that's a reflection of how over time we in the United States have come to see intelligence as being a more and more important function of government.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Well, one thing that I discovered by reading your work was the work of a seminal figure in the 1880s and 1890s. Now, maybe it's because I haven't studied military history as much that he never came across my radar. And that's Arthur Wagner and his book. Talk about that a bit.
Yeah, Arthur Wagner was one of these reform-minded officers. He was an Army officer who much of his career he was teaching at Fort Leavenworth, and the various names for the schools that were at Fort Leavenworth. These days it's the Army's Command and General Staff College. And he wrote a couple of textbooks that became basically the standard text for for U.S. Army officers at West Point and in the National Guards and that sort of thing. One was on operations. And the second one was published in 1893, if I recall correctly, and it was called The Service of Security and Information. So in the argot of the time, the service of security was how an army in the field maintained its security against things like surprise, right? And the service of information was how it gathered information about where the enemy army was, what they were doing, what direction they were moving, all that sort of stuff. Okay. So most of this book is about things like pickets and cavalry patrols and that sort of thing. But there are a couple of chapters which are really very forward-looking, where he talks about at the level of the War Department. So we have, my book is about stuff going on in the intel stuff going on in the field. He doesn't use the word intel, but that's what it is. But the War Department in Washington, if we're going to fight a good war, they need to have collected and collated and put together a whole lot of information in peacetime about the overall strength of the enemy that we're likely to face, and about maps, and all kinds of stuff.
And that was new, right?
Yeah.
At least I can't think of a prominent case in the 100 years before that when a U.S. figure was putting all that together and saying we need this central function.
That's right. And he also talks about sort of more picayune detail about intelligence operations that aren't necessarily military, more to the point, aren't exclusively military in their nature.
Okay.
The importance of open source, reading the adversary's newspapers. He talks about you can assume that the enemy is reading the newspapers from your side, so they can be conduits for disinformation. He talks about the use of spies and tactics associated both with spies, with espionage and with counter-espionage, a whole series of things. He actually even talks about, I think it's added in the revised edition later in the 1890s, but talks about tapping telegraph cables to intercept communications, signals intelligence, as we would call it these days. So there's a lot of really forward-leaning stuff here beyond just infantry pickets and cavalry patrols, so that you don't get surprised in the night out in the field.
Your characterization of this is that a lot of it is what we would see now as kind of anodyne or very simple, but it did preview a lot of the modern conceptions of intelligence, especially on the trustworthiness of spies, even though some of his characterizations are odd, that officers who spied were, of course, of exalted character and distinguished courage, but civilian spies were basically the scum of the earth.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's so interesting. There's very much distinctions made between classes of people here. Indeed. And I just add that Wagner's book, The Service of Security and Information, was being used in the U.S. Army into the 1910s. So it had a really long shelf life, and he was very much thought of as one of the Army's big intellectuals, much to his frustration, because what he really wanted to do was have a command, and instead, no, he got pegged as the smart guy, at Leavenworth or later at the War College here in Washington, and he really wanted to be out in the field leading troops. But
that's fascinating.
That was not his lot.
That means that this book, in its many subsequent editions, was used, and therefore officers who were in World War I were familiar with it because it was around for 20 plus years.
Something like that. Yeah.
So an entire generation plus of officers would be familiar with its concepts.
Now, in fairness, it would be the World War I officers who came from the regular Army who would have been familiar with Wagner's works.
Right.
And they were just a small part of the U.S. Army, but also, of course, they spread their knowledge to the gazillion conscripts who joined the U.S. military during the war.
And the first edition of this book, because there were many subsequent editions over
17
time.
or 18, something like that.
Do you have the first edition?
I do not. It is out there in Google Books in full text. I think my personal copy is, don't quote me on this, but maybe the 13th or something like that.
Now I'm just curious, how many copies of the original are out there, and are any for sale? So intrepid listeners, if you're out there on eBay or some of the specialized rare book
sites. They're not
sites.
cheap, but they're not insanely expensive. I've seen them on used book sites. So.
Oh, wow. So it is possible. Okay. If anyone's listening, that's a great holiday gift for David Priess. So moving past Arthur Wagner himself, we, as Americans, tend to think very recently. We don't have the long scope of history, such that we even forget some of our own formative moments in forming the country, like the Spanish-American War and the Philippine insurgency and other things. But those are important to you to make the case that World War I gave birth to modern American intelligence. You have to show what we collectively had or did not have in those earlier conflicts, and how, again, maybe they planted some seeds for what came about in the First World War, but they weren't quite there yet. Characterize the Spanish-American War and the Philippine insurgency both in terms of what they did do regarding intelligence, and more importantly, what they really hadn't pulled together yet.
Yeah, so I'm going to divide that into two parts: the Spanish-American War itself, and then the Philippine insurgency, which followed. So in the run-up to the Spanish-American War, the Military Intelligence Division, and it had a variety of different names during the period that my book covers. I'm just going to call it that. Wagner was actually ahead of it when the Spanish-American War was in the run-up to the Spanish-American War. And the Military Intelligence Division and the Office of Naval Intelligence did a whole lot of intelligence preparation for a war with the Spanish, and were major inputs then to war plans, right? We also had an experience in the run-up to the war with attempted politicization at a very high level. Wagner was invited by the Secretary of War to come brief on Cuba and the circumstances in Cuba, as we're about to send the U.S. Army there, brief the Secretary and also the President. And during the course of this, he mentioned, yellow fever in Cuba, which is, presently raging at this time of year, and American troops are not going to handle this well. This will be a serious problem. And the Secretary of War was incensed that this intelligence guy would deign to deliver, news that might imply that the military plans that, the Secretary and the President were contemplating might not be, optimal. And basically, threatened to, see that he never got promoted again or, face career consequences.
Wow.
But to his credit, he stuck to his guns.
That's fascinating for two reasons, Mark. One is that we have a case study of politicization or some version of it as early as, 1898?
1898.
That would have been.
Yeah.
But secondly, and this caught my ear, you just said that you had essentially an intelligence guy, one of the early ones, briefing the President of the United States.
Yeah.
Which, yes, you had people who were in spy rings talking to Washington, and you had Lincoln getting Pinkerton talking to him about some collection. But when it comes to what we would call foreign intelligence, something involving U.S. foreign policy, national security, as far as I know, there weren't a lot of briefings for presidents before this.
No, and there wouldn't be actually through the entire, up through the end of World War I, actually.
Right.
A few presidents come and go very, very briefly in my book. But the bulk of what my book is talking about is intelligence done for cabinet level departments and for military forces in the field. Intelligence done for the War Department, for the Navy Department, and for the Department of State, and I don't touch on it a lot, but for justice also during World War I. But yeah, presidents pop in and out here, and this was a notable occasion because it was a very rare event, no question about that. So a lot of the two service intel organizations put together a lot of intel, a lot of reference materials on Cuba and all that sort of stuff in the run up to the war, and then. For the actual war itself, both offices were all but disestablished. They were left with literally one or two people, and the officers who'd been part of it were actually sent to Army and Navy units to actually go operate, right? But interestingly enough, the U.S. Army commander in Cuba didn't actually even want to have an intel officer and an intel staff at his headquarters. So Wagner, who would have been an obvious guy, wandered off and ended up working in Puerto Rico, supporting the U.S. commander there, not in Cuba, which was sort of the big show in the Caribbean. He got his satisfaction later when he wrote a kind of a lessons learned after action report, not really an intel function, but on how the war was gone, and criticized heavily the U.S. commander in Cuba.
Do I understand right that at least some of the concern with the Army having spies in the Caribbean was an ethical concern?
Yes.
They said that's not what we do.
Yes. Ethical concerns are very important and a very limiting factor in U.S. intelligence in this period up to when we enter World War I, and then that changes.
Right.
And I argue that change sticks, actually, and that one of the key things that comes out of World War I, or is going to come out of World War I later in our conversation, is that it became more and more accepted that it is ethical to have peacetime espionage as well. Okay, so that's basically what happened, with regard to the Spanish-American War. In the Philippines, then, so after the United States seized the Philippines from Spain, oddly enough, a rather large number of Filipinos didn't like simply being transferred as colonial subjects from Spain to the United States. Indeed. And an insurgency started in a good bit of the Philippines, and the United States Army, at varying levels of intensity, would be involved in fighting that for roughly a decade. And so we're talking here counterinsurgency. And what you saw there then was a lot of really grassroots learning in the Army out in the field in the various far-flung bits of the Philippines. And one of the key innovations that they came up with was intelligence officers in one region, in one area, would keep card files, which were a pretty new technology. Not brand new, but a pretty new technology at this time, which is kind of mind-boggling to think about. Would keep card files on the insurgents in their area, right? They're tracking the personalities in the insurgent networks in their area. And every card, they make two of them, actually, one for local use, and they send another one up to higher headquarters. So the next higher headquarters has a visibility on sort of the overall operational picture. And anytime they get, revised or additional information about somebody who's already in their card file, they'll, amend it here and again make another copy and send it up to higher headquarters. And you also, by the way, in the Philippines, start to get some intelligence officers, and I point here particularly at an officer named Ralph Van Diemen, who also starts to be very concerned about counterespionage issues, and in particular, not so much counterespionage against the Filipino insurgents, but rather against the Japanese. And the Japanese, obviously, we don't fight the Japanese in World War I, and indeed nominally they're an ally in World War I, but there's a great deal of concern throughout this entire period about the potential threat of Japan and from an intel perspective, particularly the espionage threat from Japan. And maybe a little bit of a diversion here, but I'll just mention that it's sort of interesting these days in the intelligence business. We talk about certain countries being hard targets, right? Like Russia and North Korea and China, right? It's really hard to collect intelligence on these countries for a variety of reasons, including that they tend to, be police states and have a lot of domestic security and all that sort of stuff. Well, you look at the way the intelligence officers of, 1905, 1915, 1925 were talking about Japan, and it's, they're not using the term hard target. Nobody's invented it, but like in our terms, that's what it is. That's what it was to them.
And it would have been very hard, not just logistically, although that's true also, but just because Japan had only opened up relatively recently, and there's not a massive amount of Western population there to use for spying. So I would imagine it'd be very difficult, right?
Absolutely. And I just add also that while there's great concern in the U.S. military, and in particular among its very small number of intelligence personnel, about the Japanese threat, the military threat, and also the Japanese espionage threat, there's a great deal of admiration in the U.S. military for Japan as well, because Japan has gone from being way behind the state of the art with its military to being top-notch. And really, frankly, ahead in a lot of ways of what the U.S. military was at the time. And gosh, they could do it. Wouldn't it be great if we did this stuff too? And
it caught my eye as well, just because something I think I'd seen tangentially years ago, but not focused on, is that during the Russo-Japanese War, ONI did produce updates for the president and the cabinet. Yeah. So there is some service of the senior level policymakers, not just tactical commanders or the bureaucracy within the department.
Yes,
which is absolutely fascinating.
And indeed, also both the U.S. military sent quite a number of observers to observe the war, both from the Japanese side and from the Russian side, and as did a great many other countries, including all the leading powers of Europe. And one of the observers actually was a guy named John J. Pershing, who we may hear of something from later.
That's a name that sticks with me, so we'll come back to it. The other detail I don't want to let go before we move into that, just before the First World War, is something that, and your book is full of these, but one is regarding the Philippines that, ONI was asked, okay, what do you have on the Philippines as we're getting involved in this war? And this is 1898. And what does ONI come up with?
As I recall, they come up with an article from the Encyclopedia Britannica.
Wow.
I mean, better than nothing. At least they had a copy of the
open
Encyclopedia.
Source, right?
Yeah, open source. Yeah.
But
right. So this indicates that the overall intel effort in Washington, in the War Department and the Navy Department, is not very big, and therefore it necessarily has to be focused in certain places. And and among the key things, by the way, that U.S. intelligence was focused on at the time that we don't tend to think about a whole lot was one, Canada, which belonged to Britain at the time, and Mexico.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
The possibility that we might have to go operate in some place like the Philippines. Well. That's, before the Spanish-American War comes along, that doesn't seem very likely. Like, it doesn't make the list of what we're going to do with our, very limited number of hours in the work week.
Right. So it's fair to say that until at least, the mid-1910s, that people had poked and prodded and thought about some of these issues, but it hadn't really institutionalized in the United States government.
I think that's fair. There's been a lot of thinking, and there have been micro-scale doings, but not institutionalized in any kind of really serious and substantial, I guess I would say, kind of way.
And then war comes, and at first the United States, of course, is not directly involved, but kind of sees, even before we get involved, sees on the horizon this is a severe national security threat, in part because of a lot of German actions against United States shipping and support to England, et cetera. But it didn't spur the kind of institutionalization that came during the conflict, because a lot of what you talk about is the actual operationalization of intelligence in the battlefield. But it does begin before the war itself in terms of some of the activities like the ONI using collection and using undercover officers. Talk through how that mechanism developed.
Yeah. So during this period of the late summer, early fall of 1914, when the war starts in Europe, up until April 1917, when the United States declares war and actually becomes a belligerent, various components of the U.S. government start expanding, or both their execution and also their sort of thinking and planning about intelligence. And one you touched on is fairly late in the game, before 1916, if I recall correctly. But again, don't quote me on this. ONI starts thinking about the possibility that they're going to need to expand their espionage collection. Well, actually create an espionage collections capability, and starts putting together plans for doing that. They don't get very far down the road in actually doing anything, but they put together some plans. And a lot of this depends, by the way, on making use of what we would today call commercial cover, right, of having Navy officers and collectors pretending to be, or indeed actually being, employees of private companies to give them, a legitimate reason for being in a particular place doing particular kinds of things.
That implies, though, that there's no established tradecraft for this.
That's
They're
absolutely
kind
right.
of winging it and just hoping that it works.
They're not
without
kind of winging
learning
it,
lessons from the past.
They're very much winging it.
Wow.
Yeah. The kind of espionage that Arthur Wagner had written about in his book was, very much an espionage related to the battlefield, right? What David Kahn might have called primarily visual intelligence, like looking with eyeballs. Visual intelligence later, and also
observational,
recon. Later on, looking at photographs.
Okay,
but it ultimately revolves around eyeballs. And certainly, ONI starts thinking about that sort of thing, and both services, in terms of espionage, will go on to do visual intelligence, visual espionage during the war. But also, there's more and more attention O&I, in the run-up to the war, and then by both services during the war, to collecting what David Kahn calls verbal intelligence, whether it's reporting on what people said, it's stealing documents, those sorts of things. The kind of thing that these days we tend to reflexively think about when we think about espionage, right?
Yeah.
What was Aldrich Ames giving the Soviets? Well, he wasn't, minimally, if at all, was he doing things like describing the inside of CIA headquarters. What he was doing was giving them documents that had words on them, right?
But you could definitely see why in this period both were important, because going into the war, you had to know, which ports had which ships that could come across, and where were Germans doing things that are purely observational. But the realization, no, we need strategic plans. We need intentions, which are easier to determine from actual documents or whispers, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The other thing, major preparation that the United States makes during that period when we're neutral in the war was in 1916, the State Department actually creates an intelligence office. This is under Secretary of State Leland Harrison, who, by the way, was the uncle of a guy you may have heard of named Allen Dulles.
Got it.
His minor figure later on. But the State Department was motivated to do this because during that period that the United States is neutral, one of the things that it's doing is it is selling a lot of munitions to the Allies, to the British, to the French, to the Russians. Much to the annoyance of the Germans and also the Austro-Hungarians. And the Germans start conducting espionage operations here in the United States. They also start conducting sabotage operations in the United States. There's a rash of fire bombings of merchant ships bound for Europe, American merchant ships bound for Europe. I think something like 36 or so of them get firebombed. A couple of munitions depots, most famously Black Tom outside New York City, get blown up.
Talk about that, because I was shocked when I was teaching a graduate class recently and I mentioned this. I got blank stares. People had not heard of this, which is a massive attack within the United States. What was the Black Tom?
Yeah, Black Tom was the name of an island in the New York area that was basically an ammunition depot, and a rather large one. And in particular, in late 1916, it was there was a lot of ammunition there that was bound, if I recall correctly, had been sold and was awaiting shipment, I think, to Russia, to one of the Allies. I believe it was Russia. And German agents, not Germans, but as far as we know, but Americans recruited by the Germans, blew it up. And this was an enormous big explosion, and windows were blown out like miles and miles away, and et cetera, et cetera. It was a big deal.
And people died.
People died. Yeah, quite a number. I don't recall the death count, but yeah, quite a number of people died. Yeah. So there were things like that going on. Also, there were the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians were conducting a lot of their diplomats, their diplomatic representation here was conducting a lot of what seemed to the U.S. government as propaganda and even subversion inside the United States. And it's worth remembering that at that time, there was a very large German-American population in the United States, indeed many of whom were actually, in citizenship terms, German. There were a lot of actual German reserve officers who, had emigrated to the United States, but were actually still on the rolls of the German Army Reserve or the Austro-Hungarian Army Reserve. And indeed, a bunch of them did go back to serve there. And this was also an era in which the second most commonly spoken language in the United States was not Spanish the way it is today. It was German, right? And so there's all these things that the German and the Austro-Hungarian diplomats are doing internally to the United States that are problematic. And so Secretary of State Leland Harrison creates something that's called the Bureau of Secret Intelligence, whose initial job is to just basically do domestic counterintelligence against these efforts by the Germans and secondarily the Austro-Hungarian Empire here in the U.S.
Right.
They're doing a lot of this not actually with State Department personnel, but with people loaned to them by the Secret Service and other organizations. And then over time, particularly as after we get into the war, that actually expands into doing espionage overseas. We actually have the State Department running espionage operations, a lot of which look very much like the kinds of espionage operations that the CIA does these days, or that the FSB does against us. But it had its roots there in that sort of twilight period in 1916.
One of the interesting developments as the war begins, of course, ONI, the Navy itself is expanding, and the Army, the War Department realizes, okay, we're going to war. And so, of course, the intelligence functions grow, and you have intelligence officers going out to various levels of command. But you also have the American Expeditionary Force itself as an entity that has an intelligence function.
Right. Yeah. So the Spanish-American War is the last time in which a major U.S. Army in the field is going to not have an intelligence officer and an intelligence shop. Mm-hmm. When General John J. Pershing is selected to command the American Expeditionary Force, and at the time it wasn't realized how big it was eventually going to get. I mean, people were thinking maybe a division, maybe something a bit bigger than that. But anyway, Pershing set sail with his hand-selected staff, mm-hmm. some of whom had done intel work for him in the punitive expedition in Mexico just months before. But he heads across, and actually in that first ship, he actually has exactly one intelligence officer who's designated as you're going to be an intelligence officer.
Well, at least he's got one. That's
a
start.
He's got one. Yeah, it's Dennis Nolan, and Major then eventually Brigadier General Dennis Nolan. And Pershing arrives in Britain and then France, and Pershing and his staff undergo a very steep learning curve about basically everything, but intelligence is certainly one of these. Mm-hmm. And the Brits and the French, sort of summarize it all, say, one intel officer? Are you freaking kidding me? And and the AEF's G2, as it's soon to be called, expands radically from there.
Okay.
And just grows and grows and grows up to basically the end of the war.
And is it fair to characterize it simply as Pershing and those around him, talking to the Brits and the French, kind of realized pretty quickly we can learn from these guys?
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
And so part of the intel function is presumably them realizing as they're landing troops, and especially as it really picks up later, that we need more information if we're going to act successfully here. But you're also getting pressure from the Allies saying, kind of, get your act together. This is no way to run an army without any information.
Well, absolutely. I mean, look, World War I on the Western Front, there's a continuous front line, mm-hmm. right, that runs all the way, kind of a zigzag or a lazy S shape, but runs all the way from the Swiss border to the North Sea.
Yeah.
Okay. And if any of those armies, mm-hmm. Collapses in the face of a German onslaught, they're all screwed.
Right. They get behind the line. Yep.
Yeah. And so two implications of that. One, as you just noted, the British and the French are like, hey, you need to get to work on creating an intel function, and here's all our regulations and our field manuals and stuff on how we do intel. You can train your people at our intel schools, and we'll loan you people, and you can embed people with us to learn. All that kind of mm-hmm. learning goes on there. But also, the British and the French are very motivated to share intelligence with the American Expeditionary Force. And once the AEF actually starts producing intelligence, collecting and producing intelligence, yeah. It similarly wants to share with its allies. It's in everyone's enlightened self-interest, right? Mm-hmm. The Allied front line is only as strong as its weakest link, right? And intelligence is a key component of being able to defend, let alone actually attack.
That all sounds very good, Mark, but you make it sound like out of the kindness of their hearts and some enlightened self-interest, the British and the French are helping the United States create this intelligence capability. But is there any evidence they were seeking to influence as well as inform, that they were in a sense not propagandizing, but certainly pushing the United States where they wanted it to go for their own reasons, even if it wasn't a perfect fit for the United States at that time?
Sort of. It depends on how you define that question. So I would say in terms of battlefield kinds of intelligence, no. Mm-hmm. But back of that, mm-hmm. The going in position from the British and the French was that the American Expeditionary Force should not operate as an independent army. Mm-hmm. Rather, Pershing should sort of be an administrator, for American troops who would be slotted into British divisions and slotted into French divisions. And Pershing and Wilson were having none of that. We were going to have a U.S. Army as such in the war, occupying a hunk of the front line. And once that was determined, right, it was in the French and British self-interest to.
That makes sense.
Right. Now, however, farther afield, the United States wants to get into the espionage business, and here, outside the battlefield context, right? And here we're talking particularly, not exclusively, but particularly about espionage operations run out of neutral countries, much like what happened with Switzerland and Allen Dulles during World War II. And in the Cold War, Austria was an infamous hotbed of espionage. Similar sort of deal, right? Switzerland, Denmark, Sweden. Were, in the Netherlands, Switzerland and the Netherlands, probably the two most important actually, were, gateways into spying on Germany, or to a much lesser extent spying on the Austro-Hungarians. And here, the British would have been quite happy if the Americans didn't do that.
Because they were doing their own thing.
They were doing their own thing. They didn't want us in the way. They didn't want us screwing up because we didn't have nearly as much experience as they did. Well, let me rephrase this. They didn't have a lot of experience either, right? 3 years or something at this point. But that still that's the steep part of the learning curve. That's still a whole lot more qualitatively, even if not chronologically, than we had. They also, interestingly enough, were afraid, and I think with some reason, that if U.S. case officers, as we would call them today, were out there trying to recruit spies, that we were going to drive up the prices, right? The Americans, what do the Americans have? They have lots of people and they have lots of money, right? And it's, and if suddenly the Americans start throwing a lot of cash around, they're gonna steal all the good sources from us, the British and the French. And there are bits and pieces of suggesting that in various places, in those venues and other places, the British and the French sometimes tried to sort of, nudge us a little bit with what they weren't sharing with us. But that said, there was actually a lot of cooperation, not just exchanging of intel there in the field, in these countries away from the front lines, but also joint operations. Actually, joint operations being run by Americans with French or Americans with Brits or whoever.
And that's new for America, right? We didn't have any history of that.
Right. That's true. This general notion of intelligence sharing and joint intelligence cooperation, joint intelligence operations, is, as far as I know, novel in World War I. It's possible there may have been some super minor stuff going on in the Boxer Rebellion in China. I'm not sure there was, but there's not a lot of venues in which we'd gone to war as part of a coalition before. And so, this was very much novel in World War I. And one of the important things that's going to continue up in the interwar period, obviously during World War II and right up through today.
Yeah. You researched the hell out of the actual operations and individual memos and conversations regarding all of this during the war itself. But let me take it up one level.
Okay.
Is it fair to characterize it as the ONI, the Navy, the whatever it was called then, MID,
Military
MDI,
Intelligence Division.
Military Intelligence Division in the Army.
War Department.
As well as the American Expeditionary Forces Intel Unit, that all of them were doing both some espionage and counter-espionage.
Yes.
A different balance, but all of them were getting experience in all of these things.
That is correct, yes. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because the counterintelligence and counter-espionage effort here in the United States, which actually State Department had got into initially, was a major component of U.S. intelligence efforts in the war. It was a really big deal, and the Military Intelligence Division and the Office of Naval Intelligence put a lot of effort into it, working frequently in cooperation with, sometimes at cross purposes, with the Department of Justice. And I don't really focus on that much in the book, but the Department of Justice and the forerunner to the FBI are certainly part of this.
But it was a massive domestic counterintelligence effort, right? In part because of the fear, inflated, but the fear of Germany's infiltrated us with hundreds of thousands of spies.
Yeah.
But also, you did have the Black Tom explosion, so there was some evidence for bad things happening here. And then legally, you did get things like the Espionage Act in 1917 that allowed the government to do more using what is now we would call intelligence units to investigate potentially dangerous Americans and others in America.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And the American intelligence paid a lot of attention, for instance, well, a couple points. So first off, there was no kidding Central Power espionage and sabotage and probably propaganda and subversion to some degree in that period when the United States was neutral. Once the United States entered the war, for a variety of reasons, the actual level of those efforts, the actual espionage and subversion, et cetera, threat went to just this side of zero. Wow. First off, because the Espionage Act comes along pretty quickly and there's pretty draconian penalties for violating that. And secondly, because now that there's a war on, it becomes extraordinarily difficult for German intelligence all the way back in Berlin or wherever to actually communicate with spies and agents here.
That's a fair point. We forget the technology at the time was not allowing the kinds of communication we have now.
Right. And on top of that, the telegraph cables and the mail were censored. So there are a handful, and I mean literally a handful of people who either were or probably were German spies in the United States during the time we were actually at war.
There's one of them.
Minuscule.
There's one of them I want to ask you about, and he went by a different name, Pablo Waberski. What in brief is his story?
Yeah, so he was an agent for the Germans, recruited in Europe, Spain, if I recall correctly, and sent to infiltrate the United States through Mexico and to stir up domestic unrest here in the United States. Interestingly enough, so he gets to Mexico. And he starts, journeying up towards the U.S. border. And along the way, he ends up being accompanied / followed / surveilled by not only an American agent, but also a British agent.
Wow.
And he's basically arrested the moment he gets across the border. Well,
that's impressive.
Yeah.
So we've talked about espionage. We've talked about counter-espionage. You mentioned a bit about propaganda. And we won't get too much into that, but the fact is some of these intelligence units were doing anti-German propaganda positively. But the analysis part we haven't talked about as much. There was one effort during the war to do not analysis at the tactical level, right? Not briefing the commander, this is where we think the troops are, but up at the strategic level. And it was a group with the fascinating, and I'll try to pronounce it with capital letters in both words so it sounds as important as it comes across as. It's called The Inquiry. What was The Inquiry? Who was involved? And what evidence do we have that the material they produced was useful to anyone?
Yeah, so The Inquiry was set up fairly late in the war, 1918, to start thinking for the U.S. government about what the peace might look like, to do some planning for that, which is a wonderful endeavor. They were a lot of academics and other people with actual expertise in various parts of Europe and that sort of thing. It was a pretty high-powered, capable group. They received a lot of intel from the military and from military intelligence, and then after the war was over, and you get to the peace talks at Versailles, they actually go, or at least a lot of them do, and are augmented by a bunch of U.S. government intel officers.
Okay.
The thing is, though, that they're not tremendously useful, certainly not with regard to the big picture issues, because basically Wilson is running the show, right? There's a nominally, officially there's a 5-person U.S. delegation with support staff, obviously. A 5-person U.S. delegation of whom, President Wilson is one, but basically Wilson's the only one who mattered. And he had his own ideas. And there was, as a practical matter, the intel input to the U.S. president in those peace talks was minimal. Right. But it's an interesting sort of forerunner. It's not formally speaking governmental initially. It's not governmental initially, formally speaking. It sort of gets grafted on towards, in 1918, 1919. But it's kind of an interesting forerunner of, say, the Office of Strategic Services Research and Analysis branch during World War II. Whole lot of academics and people with like real serious intellectual gravitas and deep expertise in this part of the world or that part of the world.
So the difference is that they didn't governmentalize it, if I can make up that word, right? They didn't make the members of the inquiry formal government employees.
Yeah.
They just kind of used them for a while out of the patriotism in their hearts. But it did set the stage for that OSS effort, which then in turn set the stage for a professional analytic corps, which had experts of areas around the world as we have now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's also worth noting that while in Washington there was not a lot of what you and I would recognize as intelligence analysis going on, there was some, not a lot. And most of it wasn't particularly sophisticated. It tended to be more, putting together, reference works and stuff like that.
Right.
Which is analysis, but not very sophisticated. But everybody has to start somewhere. That's not true in the AEF. The AEF is doing much more high-speed things in a lot of ways. But some useful thinking is done about that is useful to intelligence analysis and to the sort of future practice of intelligence analysis. And in the War Department, in the Military Intelligence Division, that is to say, they look at this war that we're engaged in, right? And they see a war not just of armies in the field and navies at sea against each other, but of entire societies, right? Entire economies, entire sort of ideological systems, the whole kit and caboodle, where it's all in conflict. So that's number one. Number two, they also see that that even with regard to the military effort, right, that we're in an age of industrial warfare, and so the weapons and the ammunition have to come from somewhere. They come from factories, and factories is civilians work in factories, and so things like the political preferences of the civilians and their loyalties and all their morale and all of this sort of their commitment to the war effort, all that is like a part of the war effort, right? Or if you are if someone out there is encouraging draft evasion, well, that's keeping a soldier off the battlefield every bit as much as shooting the soldier in France would do, right? So they're seeing this as wars of entire societies, and so they say, okay, what kinds of information are our decision makers going to need in order to guide this or future kinds of wars? And they break it down into four types. They need military information, obviously, so right, size and strength of foreign military forces and all that sort of stuff. They need economic information about potential adversaries. They need political information, foreign policies and that sort of stuff. And they need what they call psychologic information, which is these days we would think of as primarily as sort of cultural intelligence. And unsurprisingly, a lot of this, you look at a lot of these products with today's eyes, and they're like trafficking in a whole lot of really fairly distasteful racist stereotypes sometimes. But the notion that actually understanding the culture of your adversary or your potential adversaries, or for that matter of your potential allies, is important, right? And that's an insight they had here. And if you look, this typology of military, economic, political, and psychologic, if I recall correctly, they're actually using psychologic, not psychological, intelligence is a sort of a fundamental typology of what we need. Carries forward into the early Cold War, at least in the U.S. intelligence community, or in what became the U.S. intelligence community. The one thing we haven't talked about much is the actual intelligence in combat. The U.S. forces did engage in serious combat. Two main areas: the salient for a few days, Samuel, right,
and then eventually the big offensive, right? So, if I understand it right, the intelligence in combat was decent to good, not as good as the British and French,
but entirely respectable,
but good, and across several different aspects of intelligence. They got experience in everything: the espionage, the counterespionage, the propaganda, reconnaissance, signals work, that you actually had an experience and you recognize everything that happens in modern intelligence during those actual battlefield events.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's one of the points that I try and make in my book, is that there's a realization that comes to the United States sort of intelligence world during, actually even sort of it's creeping up on them even before we enter World War I, but it really blossoms during World War I, that we are best able to figure out what's going on if we bring multiple different sources and multiple different forms of intelligence collection to bear on the same problem.
What an idea.
I know, crazy, huh? All source intelligence analysis. Yes, right, there was aerial reconnaissance, most notably, though not exclusively, from aerial photography, which really blossoms and gets quite sophisticated during this period. There's signals intercept and code breaking. And by the way, if we're breaking their codes, they're probably breaking our codes. So there's this huge effort, by the way, into building American code systems so that we can replace them when we think they've been compromised. There is, all sorts of visual intelligence, including right down to, literally sending patrols out into no man's land and that sort of like super dangerous stuff, by the way. There is what we would call, exploitation of foreign materiel, right? Like, so, okay, a German fighter plane has crashed behind our lines. Let's go see what let's analyze it and see what the latest, German aviation technology is, and maybe we can steal some of it, or, things like this.
That doesn't sound, now maybe for America that's new, but that doesn't sound new to me. That's like Caesar in Gaul finding some new slingshot that that they're using against Roman troops and saying we need to figure out what they're doing and its range. That's not new in the history of warfare, but it's new for America being in a war of this size.
Right, and it's also being put into an institutionalized or bureaucratized and institutionalized kind of context. Yeah, okay. Absolutely. There's open source, reading German newspapers and whatnot, usually acquired through these neutral countries like Switzerland. There's liaison sharing intelligence with your allies. And on the signals intelligence side, it's not just a question of intercepting and breaking enemy communications, both radio and also telegraph and field telegraph and field telephone, but also of what would come to be known as traffic analysis. So you looking at the patterns of German radio communications. Even if you're not able to read what they're saying, you can get the call sign, i.e. the code name, if you will, of the radio sending the message, and the call sign of the radio they're sending it to. They're not encrypted, right? So you can tell who's talking to whom for how long and when, and you look at the patterns in this. This is something we learned from the Allies. We learned a lot of this from the Allies. You look at the patterns of this, and you're able to make inferences about what the Germans are up to. Before a raid, I'm just making this up, but before a raid, German divisional and regimental radio networks will do thus and such. So look for that pattern, right? For instance, right? And also, espionage. So this is espionage deep inside Germany. Isn't being done by the American Expeditionary Forces, but it's being done directly to help them. The British and the French, with some help from the Americans late on, particularly operating out of Denmark, have put together train watching networks inside of Germany and inside of occupied Belgium and France. And the idea here is that when the Germans are moving, or the Austro-Hungarians for that matter, are moving divisions from one front to another, or potentially even raising new divisions, they go on trains, until the last little way. They go on trains, and we know that a German infantry regiment will require this many railroad cars of this type, and a German cavalry regiment will require a different number of railroad cars of this type, and some of them will be for carrying horses and so forth and so on. And you recruit as spies people deep in the enemy interior who
just to watch the trains,
exactly, and report on that. And so you can tell things like they're moving some divisions from the east to the west. There might be an offensive coming, or the other way around, or things like that, to give kind of strategic warning of major German moves. And even on the aerial reconnaissance side, not on aerial photography, but like on just visual aerial reconnaissance, they even discover they're able to do, and they learn this from the French. They even discover that they're able to do useful things at night. You can see fires at night. You can see. Remember, this is an era in which trains are are burning coal. You can actually see
the trains
locomotives that are driving, right? So and if you map where you see fires and where you see trains at night over time on a map, you can often see big German forces moving from way back over there to getting closer and closer and closer. And then there'll be an attack. So there's all kinds of actually really sophisticated things that the AEF intel folks, again, most of it learned from the Allies, are doing.
Okay, I think you've convinced me.
Okay,
I think that I was wrong, and that in fact World War I did move the ball forward more than slightly. I still don't feel like on the analytic point.
Yes.
It moved very far forward. It's certainly regarding the president, but even
definitely regarding
even anyone at a senior level, there doesn't seem to be much evidence, and maybe just some of it hasn't survived, but there doesn't seem to be much evidence for an advanced analytic function developing during the war.
No, I think that's fair. I think in Washington, analysis is largely restricted to putting together reference materials. Mm-hmm. In the AEF, senior commanders, Pershing, and then when he splits into the AEF into a couple of different armies, Army commanders, and lower level, the senior commanders, they're receiving things that are no kidding intelligence analysis.
Got it.
They don't tend to have the form that you and I might be familiar with from when we were in the business, but they are getting that. But in Washington, that will largely be a function that certainly blossoms later, not in this war. That's
so if this is true, and you had, I think people forget, and we'll get to this memory issue in a moment, but people forget just how massive the U.S. intervention in World War I was. How big was the AEF at its peak?
So this topped out at something like 1.9 million, I think. A lot of people.
That's incredible. And of course, the people who were doing the work there, whether it's senior officers or enlisted, you've got people who then, a couple of decades later, are involved in another major conflict and certainly are aware of some of these lessons and are aware of some of the experience in various places. And yet you could have someone like Allen Dulles, a future director of Central Intelligence, but somebody who was involved in this, who went on to do intelligence in World War II and then help lead in the Cold War. He could say that, and this is his quote, "The lessons learned from bitter experience were lost and forgotten." And he was far from the only one. There were many people who said, well, it was really only World War II that led to intelligence. Why is this? Why is the legacy of intelligence in World War I so weak that even people involved in it would forget and say that it was all happening really during the Second World War?
Because the CIA and its predecessor, the Office of Strategic Services during World War II, have sucked almost all the air out of the room. I mean, that's the short answer, is that U.S. intelligence history is very heavily, by no means exclusively, but very heavily centered on what the CIA has done. It was created in 1947, as you know, and sort of with honorable mention then for the OSS and it's sort of the brief transition organization between the two of the Strategic Services Unit, which existed for, 2 years, I think. What tends to get ignored is the U.S. military. And it's worth remembering that even into the first several years of the existence of the CIA, like the bulk of intel assets, of intel personnel, even within Washington, were military.
Absolutely.
Right? The CIA was a very small, extremely small organization initially, and its people, almost all of its people, were actually detailed from the State Department, the Army, the Navy, or then the new Air Force, right? And, Army intelligence, for instance, was a really big player for quite a long time, right? And they're a successor to they're an inheritor, if you will, of this tradition that I've written about in my book. And there are certainly bits and pieces of World War I influence that sneak into the OSS, and but they're few. Not zero, but few. But there's a lot of influence that carries forward in the U.S. military. And a lot of what the military personnel who actually had a background in the OSS, the military personnel in the OSS who had been in the military as opposed to join the OSS, we'll commission you, right? They would have had some exposure to this, the fact that intel is now the subject of a great many Army, they weren't called field manuals at the time, but a gazillion Army field manuals and technical manuals and all that sort of stuff. And of course, a battalion and a regiment and a brigade and a division and a corps and an army in the field all have intel staffs, right? And of course, we have security people out there who are, hunting spies and of course, sensitive people in people in sensitive positions. We look into their background and all these kinds of things. They just remember that wasn't something that the Army in Cuba in 1898 was doing at all.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And now it's just like. It's like if you're in the military, you don't even notice it. It's like you don't question it. Like, of course, this is an intrinsic part of the military business. Like, so what, right? I mean, of course, right? That's where the biggest legacy is.
Let me posit a couple of points here, and please agree with me to make me sound smart, or disagree with me to correct me. One is, and I'll posit this based in part on what I've read from your research, that part of this is due to the CIA in the 1950s, in particular, being much better at propagandizing, at selling the story of, we great warriors in the OSS and now the CIA are doing great things, similar to the way that the FBI did about chasing gangsters and criminals in the 20s, the G-men in the 20s and 30s, going after everyone from, organized crime to communist spies in the country. And the military just wasn't very good at it, that all these people you talked about who had this experience in the First World War, they were not writing the dozens or hundreds of books like former OSS officers tended to do in the early Cold War. So what do you make of that?
No, I think that's absolutely right. And you put your finger on it too. It started with the OSS after the war. Yeah. My friend Chris Moran has written well about this. Others have touched on it as well, is that there was a very conscious decision after the war by OSS veterans, including Donovan, that we should tell our story. Because one, we did good stuff and we're proud of it and so forth and so on. And two, this is an important function of government, right? You had Hollywood movies made about the OSS, for crying out loud, right? And then Allen Dulles, I forget if he was fifth director of the CIA, but for most of the 50s, most of the Eisenhower administration, right? And he's a minor celebrity, right? So I think it's entirely fair to say that the OSS and the CIA had better PR.
But then what's the flip side of that? Why is it that with hundreds or thousands of intelligence personnel in these various areas of the U.S. military, and even the State Department, and even a bit in the Justice Department, in World War I, why is it that they were either so bad at what the OSS veterans did well, or why were they so disinterested in doing it at all?
You mean publicizing what they did?
Right.
Yeah. So it's an interesting question. And I've, a couple things. There were a certain number of memoirs written by U.S. intelligence veterans of World War I. I'm actually working on an article on this subject. It was a pretty small number. I think I came up with something like 25, a bunch of which were actually published after World War II. One of them as recently as 15 years or so ago. So there were not very many. Why is not entirely clear, but I think part of it is that there wasn't a great understanding in the U.S. public of what intelligence was. The U.S. public, to the extent they were aware of any of this, or thought they knew something about this, they thought they knew about espionage. And their understanding of what that was bore about as much resemblance to reality as James Bond does to today's reality, right? There were a certain number of, actually quite a few magazine articles and one or two books I can think of written by veterans that were basically explainers about either intel generally or, some slice of it. But I don't think there was much of a market. Would be part of it.
Okay.
Also, and I'm speculating here, but also, a lot of the ways in which the Americans tended to remember the war and the interwar period were, pretty negative, right? This was this was the trenches of France were not exactly a lot of fun, and we're not entirely sure what we were fighting for. There's certainly no good bumper sticker for what this war was about, right? And here I'm drawing particularly on a really wonderful historiographical article published, I don't know, about 7-8 years ago by Jennifer Keane of Chapman University, of whom I'm an enormous fan. She does amazing work and is just a wonderful person and a great mentor to a great many people. But she says, look, most of our major wars have had big bumper stickers, right? So the Civil War reunited the Union and ended slavery, right? And World War II defeated fascism and ended the Holocaust.
Solid narratives.
Yeah, and the Cold War was this global clash of communism against democracy, and Vietnam War was a mistake, and so forth and so on. Well, what was World War I exactly? Can you sum that up for me, David? And give me, you got 4 words, right?
Yeah, there's no bumper sticker that gets it the same way.
No, and the memories were very. Were generally pretty negative. A lot of it, and again, I'm drawing on Jennifer's work here, but a lot of it framed by fiction about the futility of all this. And one of the interesting things is there was a memoir written by an Intel enlisted guy, very tactical, sort of very much pointy end of the spear, who'd won the Medal of Honor actually, published in the mid 1930s, and he's pretty enthused about his war experience, right? He felt that, this was a great adventure, and, it was like, manly men doing manly things and all that sort of stuff. And he won the Medal of Honor, right? His book just flopped. And Jennifer argues that it's basically because this was kind of a positive spin on the war, right? And that's not what the public thought this war was about, and not what they were prepared to hear. This war was a tragedy. It was a ghastly waste. It was horrifying. We see people, men walking down the streets of the city who've been mutilated in the war, and I don't want a story about how fun this was, right? So I think there was some of that going on too.
That is a fascinating point, isn't it? That it's not just about whether there are good stories to be told. And I won't spoil it for readers of your book, but there's actually some great stories here and some names. James McNally, I think, had some great stories here, right?
Yeah, read that part of it.
And then the chase after this Pablo Vabersky guy. There's some good stories here that, yes, books, but they could have been movies. And yet I can't think of a great movie. First of all, and we can broaden this out to World War I in general, I can't think of a great movie about World War I. I've heard good things about the All Quiet on the Western Front remake. I've heard good things about a few others. But there's nothing that resonates as much as even like Patton did with So Much of America when it came out.
No.
There's nothing that really brings this alive. And yet film was going at this point. What was it? Gone with the Wind was 1938 or 1939. There was the ability for a film to take a story like this, bring it to let people see it and feel it in a way that was noble, but people weren't ready for it at that moment. People were thinking, we don't want to do that again. Let's kind of pretend it didn't happen.
Yeah. And even more so, and there's this wonderful book, and I'm embarrassed because I can't remember the title or the author's first name, but his last name is Poole, P-O-O-L-E. He's an American scholar. Book came out, 5 years or so ago. And he argues along these lines that World War I changed the nature of horror fiction, both written and in film. Ooh. And that the predominant, and I'm probably going to vastly oversimplify his argument here, so I'm a big fan of your work. If you're listening, don't hold it against me. But the predominant nature of horror up to then had been sort of gothic and haunted houses and vampires lurking in the shadows, Dracula and all that sort of stuff. And World War I occasioned a change towards body horror.
Gore,
right, about the violation of the human body.
Sounds like a future chatter guest, doesn't it?
He would be good, I think. And even the beginnings of what we now represent, what we would now call the zombie genre, right? Right, and this is, that's not an evolution that you get if there's positive memories about the noble thing we did in this.
It's a hard sell.
Yeah.
It's a hard sell. It's also, and maybe this isn't as much about why it didn't take culturally. I mean, that's just World War I in general, much less the intelligence part, right? That there wasn't an audience for it then. But you would think then after the Second World War that you could bring out some of those stories when suddenly people were much more into it, I guess.
Well, maybe. But the problem is that World War II is more recent.
Of course.
And seem particularly recent if you were living in, say, 1950.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, World War II, if we were our age in 1950, we'd have remembered World War I, but World War II was yesterday.
Yeah, yeah.
World War II, the United States was in World War II longer. We lost, super roughly 4 times as many people killed in World War II as in World War I. And and as I indicated, there's no good bumper sticker for what that war was, but we're real clear on what World War II was about, and it was a noble endeavor. We all think, right? Imagining ourselves in 1950. I mean, I still believe that. And also even just mundane things like there were a lot of war memorials that got put up in towns around the country after World War I to honor the war dead. Great. If you go to some small town somewhere, or even downtown Arlington, Virginia, where I live, there is one, right? And there's the World War I dead, and then you turn to the other side, and there's the World War II dead,
Boom.
And that's a longer list.
Yeah.
And frequently, also, they'll have Korea and Vietnam, and even some of the of the wars in the Middle East in recent times, all on there, right? And the thing that was the original reason for this memorial is now like the sort of crowded out, not out, but it's swamped by all the other stuff.
Very much so.
Right. So even those physical manifestations of the memory are, partially occluded, one might say.
That feeds into observation that Gerald Posner and I had when we recently talked about the JFK assassination and the importance of anniversaries. That it's a chance, 50-year anniversary. People are still alive. So the 50-year anniversary of, let's say, D-Day in the 1990s, you've got lots of people talking about it, or Pearl Harbor, right? 75, a little bit harder. 100, almost impossible. But 100 is such a round number that you can do 100 years, 1876, and then 1976. It's a celebration, the Declaration of Independence. The 100-year anniversary of World War I remember thinking at the time, okay, here's a chance. And crickets. Like, I don't remember anything that broke through to me as a fan of history, as a fan of national security, as, American history. It was a seminal event for the United States to get involved and have almost 2 million people involved in this. And yet the remembrance of it was muted at best.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah. I mean, there was more attention paid to it, but, that didn't mean there was a lot. It didn't even come close to meaning there was a lot of attention paid to it by the general public.
Yeah. So it seems to me that we probably could do a better job, we collectively as a society, remembering the importance of the First World War. And obviously you've contributed to this immensely with your new book on the intelligence side.
Yeah, okay, fair enough.
Right? But it brings out some stories, right? Yeah. It brings out the ability to talk about some of the individuals involved and what they did and how they did it, which is what resonates with people, right? It's not a listing of, government offices and flow charts or organizational charts. Although you have that too.
I do have one.
Right? You got that. But it's these stories of the people involved and what they did that really carry forward. And maybe there's still room for that, even if it's not a 100-year anniversary, which you missed because, you weren't quite there yet.
I know.
Right? But maybe there still is an opportunity for some of these stories to resonate. I
would like to think so. And there's a lot more work to be done on World War I intelligence. And there are some, great human stories that are good as stories, and also many of which are actually, historically important with regard to this subject, that certainly could be expanded on, and I think would make great reads and great history.
With the British and the Australian experience, to my mind, and I didn't grow up in the United Kingdom, so I can't say this with confidence, but it sure seems like Gallipoli has more of a cultural resonance with Australians and Brits than anything, perhaps everything in World War I combined to Americans. But am I missing something? Is there something that could be that story about World War I that actually makes us not necessarily feel good, but makes us feel that the First World War was important?
That's a tough one. So Australian and New Zealand, Gallipoli, are really sort of, seminal events considered today to be national tragedies. Yeah. For Britain, it's other things, though. I mean, the Somme, I think, would be the closest to that. But for the British, just generally, World War I is a really big deal. Yeah. A really big deal. For the United States, it's tough. I mean, the only thing I can really come up with that might even begin to get into that neighborhood, and frankly, I don't find it very satisfying, is that the largest battle that the United States ever fought was in World War I. It was the Meuse-Argonne campaign. by far the largest battle that the U.S. Army ever fought.
Wow.
And, not a lot of people remember it today. I mean, every historian of World War I knows about it, but, there's a good 7 or 8 of us, and I exaggerate. That's not true, but we're not exactly a big slice of the population. Let's put it that way. Yeah. But beyond that, gosh, I don't know. It's a tough one. I don't think there's a good answer.
Yeah, well, that's unfortunate because I think there is a lot here to reflect on, remember, to learn from.
Absolutely.
We close our conversations here by reaching into our vaunted chatterbox and finding a random question for you to answer.
17.
Don't worry, they're rarely embarrassing. They're very rarely things you look back on and say, I shouldn't have said that because of the criminal charges that came. Very rarely does that happen. It asks you, Mark.
Yes.
Tell us your favorite or least favorite spy or political thriller, movie or TV show. You've already mentioned James Bond once, so you can build on that, or you can put that aside.
He would be neither my favorite nor my least favorite, any of those particular movies. I think actually I'm going to go with Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy by John le Carré, which I think is just such a...
I assume on the positive side.
On the positive side,
Okay, good.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I don't tend to finish bad spy fiction, and to be honest with you, I actually don't read a lot of spy fiction. Period. Mm-hmm. But no, I would go with Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, the book, and I know not everybody agrees, but I quite like the movie version that was done.
The recent one.
Yeah, 2011, 2012. I think that's terrific too. It's this wonderful sort of self-contained world, but that has a real strong flavor of, and I've just been listening to the Le Carré podcast, has been talking about this, of sort of the shabbiness and dinginess of early 1970s Britain and the kind of malaise. And, I think Le Carré is definitely a lot more cynical than I am about a lot of things, or was. He's passed away. He really does capture a lot of the kind of real-world moral fuzziness of a lot of the world of espionage, and just in a super compelling compelling way, not just as a page turner, but also just as art.
Right. So, he doesn't always posit them as dilemmas in the way we would analyze them now. He just but he definitely describes it as sometimes choices suck.
Yeah.
Right? And that comes across.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. So I would go with that.
One thing that does not suck is your new book, which I will plug yet again, The World War I and the Foundations of American Intelligence, just out. It will definitively, and I won't let you argue with me here, it will definitively be a huge book for people studying U.S. military history, especially in the First World War, but even the period of several decades before that. But for intelligence history, it's remarkable because there's nothing else like it out there covering this period. So thank you for sticking with it over many years and doing it. Thanks for putting up with people like me who mischaracterize the era out of our ignorance. And thanks for joining me for this conversation.
Well, thanks very much. It's been a lot of fun. I appreciate it, Dave.
That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter at ThatWasChatter.